Abigail Dawson. Dear God.
Wyatt, she's one of them. No, she's not one of them. She's my wife.
She arrived as a frightened mail-order bride.
She was just a frightened virgin bought from a newspaper ad, meant to keep 3 hardened mountain men warm. But when Clara served her very first venison stew, the silver spoons dropped. Guns were drawn. Because that specific, intoxicating scent belonged to a ghost they had buried 5 years ago. According to the territorial archives of Missoula County, the winter of 1883 was one of the deadliest on record. But for 21-year-old Clara Josephine Higgins, the freezing temperatures of the Montana Territory were a paradise compared to the hell she had left behind in Boston. Clara was a woman carved from desperation. Following the sudden death of her father, Arthur Higgins, Clara had inherited nothing but a crippling mountain of gambling debts owed to a ruthless East Coast syndicate. With no family, no fortune, and her virtue being eyed as a form of payment by the city's most vile debt collectors, Clara did the only thing a respectable woman backed into a corner could do. She sold herself to the highest bidder. The advertisement in the Times, Matrimonial Times, had been brutally straightforward, lacking any of the romantic prose usually found in mail-order bride columns. It read, 3 able-bodied miners holding a lucrative claim in the Bitterroot Mountains seek a hardy woman of pure virtue. Must endure severe isolation. Will be legally wed to the eldest, Wyatt, but will care for the household of 3. Generous gold stipend sent to family upon arrival. She forged her dead father's signature on the contract, took the heavy purse of Callahan gold, sent via the Wells Fargo Express, paid off the syndicate, and boarded the Union Pacific Railroad with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's worn leather satchel. When Clara stepped off the train into the muddy, lawless streets of Missoula, she was trembling. She was a virgin, sheltered from the brutality of men, completely untouched by the harsh realities of the frontier. She stood on the wooden boardwalk, clutching her satchel to her chest, surrounded by drunken prospectors, armed cattlemen, and the suffocating smell of unwashed bodies and cheap whiskey. Then, the crowd parted. Wyatt Callahan was not just a man. He was a monument of muscle, scars, and quiet, terrifying authority. Standing over 6'3", he wore a heavy buffalo hide coat and a Stetson pulled low over eyes that were the color of forged steel. He didn't smile when he approached her. He simply looked down at the fragile, pale woman shivering in her wool coat. "You're smaller than the tintype photograph," Wyatt said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated in Clara's chest. "I assure you, Mr. Callahan, I am stronger than I look," Clara replied, trying to keep her voice from shaking. Wyatt's gaze dropped to her trembling hands. "We'll see about that. The mountain doesn't care about assurances, Miss Higgins. It only cares about endurance." He turned, expecting her to follow, and she did. The ride up into the Bitterroot Mountains was a grueling 2-day trek that stripped away the last of Clara's eastern sensibilities. As they climbed higher into the jagged, snow-capped peaks, the temperature plummeted and the dense pine forests swallowed the sunlight. Wyatt rode in absolute silence, a Winchester rifle resting across his saddle horn, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Clara rode behind him, her mind racing with terrified questions. She was legally bound to this massive, silent stranger, but the contract had explicitly stated she was to care for the household of 3 men, completely isolated from civilization. What did that mean for her? When the sun went down, whose bed was she expected to warm? Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. As night fell on the second day, a massive log cabin finally materialized through the driving snow. It was a fortress of timber and river stone, built directly into the side of a towering granite cliff. Smoke curled from a massive stone chimney, and the faint golden glow of kerosene lamps spilled out onto the snowdrifts. Wyatt dismounted and roughly pulled Clara from her horse. Her legs gave out from exhaustion, but his massive, calloused hand caught her by the waist, holding her upright with effortless strength. "Welcome home, wife," Wyatt muttered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He pushed the heavy oak door open. Clara stepped inside, her boots thudding against the wide plank floorboards. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, gun oil, and raw masculinity. The heat from the hearth was overwhelming. But it was the two men standing in the center of the room that made Clara's blood run cold. Historical accounts from Pinkerton, Detective Thomas F. Horn, later described the Callahan brothers as some of the most dangerous men to ever stake a claim in the Montana Territory. Looking at them now, Clara believed it. Leaning against the mantelpiece was Bo Callahan. He was the youngest, wildly handsome, with a head of thick, dark curls and a charming, rogue smile. But beneath the charm, his eyes held a reckless, violent spark. 2 Colt revolvers hung low on his hips, the holsters worn smooth from constant use. Sitting at the massive oak dining table, cleaning a hunting knife, was the middle brother, Levi. If Wyatt was the stoic leader and Bo was the charming killer, Levi was pure, unadulterated menace. A jagged pink scar tore across his left cheek and down his jawline, pulling his mouth into a perpetual sneer. His eyes were the pale, empty blue of glacial ice. He didn't smile as Clara entered. He looked at her as if she were a lamb walking into a slaughterhouse. "So," Bo drawled, pushing off the mantle and tipping his hat. "This is the little eastern bird we bought. I'm Bo, darlin'. Don't let my brothers frighten you. I'm the gentle one." "Don't fill her head with lies, Bo," Levi rasped, his voice sounding like 2 stones grinding together. He sheathed his knife with a sharp Times clack. "She won't last the winter, Wyatt. Look at her. She's practically shaking out of her boots. She's useless." Clara's jaw tightened. The fear that had been paralyzing her suddenly ignited into a hot flare of defensive anger. "I am not useless," she snapped, her voice echoing off the timber walls. The cabin went dead silent. Bo raised an eyebrow. Levi's pale eyes narrowed dangerously. Wyatt simply took off his Stetson and hung it on a peg. "That remains to be seen," Wyatt said calmly. He turned to face her, his massive frame blocking the firelight. "We paid a small fortune for you, Clara, but this ain't Boston. We don't need a parlor ornament. We need a woman who can keep this cabin alive while we work the claim. You're my legal wife, but none of us, not me, not Bo, not Levi, will lay a hand on you until you prove you belong here." Clara swallowed hard, clutching her mother's satchel tighter. "Prove it? How?" "By surviving," Levi sneered, stepping closer until he towered over her. He smelled of sweat and copper. "By pulling your weight. The last one thought she could just lie on her back and let us do the work. The mountain took her. It'll take you too." The last one. The words echoed in Clara's mind, freezing the blood in her veins. There had been a woman before her. What happened to her? Did they kill her? Did the isolation drive her mad? For the next 3 days, Clara lived in a state of sheer terror. The blizzard outside raged, trapping the 4 of them inside the cabin. Clara slept in a small side room, locking the door every night, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. The men left her alone, watching her with heavy predatory gazes as she swept the floors, mended their torn shirts, and stoked the fire. She felt like a mouse trapped in a cage with 3 starving wolves. On the evening of the 4th day, the test came. The cabin door slammed open in a flurry of snow and biting wind. Wyatt and Levi dragged in the massive, bloody carcass of a freshly hunted bull elk. They heaved the butchered hindquarters onto the heavy oak dining table. Blood pooled on the wood, dripping onto the floorboards. "Cook!" Wyatt ordered, his chest heaving from the exertion. Levi stood by the fire, wiping blood from his hands. "Let's see if the Virgin knows how to do anything besides look terrified. Make us a meal, Boston, or you'll be sleeping out in the barn with the mules." Clara stared at the massive slab of raw, bloody meat. She had never butchered an animal in her life. In Boston, meat came neatly wrapped in butcher's paper. But the desperate will to survive surged through her. She refused to be broken by these men. She refused to be the last one. She rolled up her sleeves, took Levi's hunting knife, and went to work. It was messy, brutal work, but she hacked away the fat and bone, dicing the meat and throwing it into a massive cast-iron Dutch oven hanging over the hearth. She added snow water, wild onions hanging from the rafters, and potatoes, but it needed more. Wild elk was incredibly gamey, carrying a harsh, metallic taste. With trembling hands, Clara opened her mother's leather satchel. It was her deepest secret. Clara's mother had not been a Boston aristocrat. Before marrying Arthur Higgins, Her mother had been a pioneer, living in the lawless Dakota territories, running with people society called outlaws and savages. She had passed down a very specific, deeply guarded knowledge of wild foraging and spices to Clara. Clara pulled out 3 small canvas pouches. Inside were crushed juniper berries, dried wild black peppercorns, and her mother's secret ingredient, a rare, high-altitude blood root mixed with charred white sage and smoked hickory salt. It was a recipe her mother swore was only known to a handful of people in the entire western frontier. She sprinkled the dark, fragrant powder into the boiling stew. Almost instantly, the cabin was filled with a thick, intoxicating, incredibly distinct aroma. It was earthy, rich, smoky, and laced with a sharp, piney bite. Clara wiped the sweat from her brow, letting the stew simmer for hours as the men cleaned their rifles in silence. Finally, she ladled the thick, dark stew into 3 tin bowls and carried them to the table. "Dinner," Clara said, her voice quiet but steady. The 3 massive men took their seats. The storm howled outside, rattling the heavy timber walls. Wyatt picked up his silver spoon. Levi and Bo did the same. Clara stood by the hearth, her heart hammering against her ribs, waiting for their judgment. Wyatt took the first bite. He stopped chewing. Levi took a spoonful. He closed his mouth, staring blankly at the wooden table. Bo took a bite. His charismatic smile instantly vanished. The cabin went dead, terrifyingly silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the howling wind. Nobody moved, nobody swallowed. Suddenly, Levi slowly lowered his spoon. The metal clinked loudly against the tin bowl. His hand, thick and scarred, dropped smoothly to the Colt, .45 resting on his hip. Wyatt stood up. He didn't just stand. He surged upward, his heavy wooden chair violently scraping backward across the floorboards. His steel-gray eyes were blown wide, fixed on Clara, with a look of absolute, horrifying disbelief. Bo's hands dropped beneath the table, the distinct times, click-clack times of twin hammers being cocked echoing in the small room. Levi stood up, his ice-blue eyes burning with a terrifying mixture of rage and panic. He drew his revolver, pointing the barrel directly at Clara's chest. "Who sent you?" Levi whispered. His voice was shaking. The ruthless, cold-blooded killer was actually trembling. Clara backed up against the hot stones of the fireplace. A scream caught in her throat. "What?" "No one." I answered the ad. Wyatt slammed his massive fist onto the table, splintering the wood. "Don't lie to me. Who taught you how to make this meal?" "My mother," Clara cried out, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It's just an old family recipe. Please." Levi stepped closer, the gun unwavering. "Your mother is dead. Everyone in that canyon is dead. We made sure of it." He looked at Wyatt, his voice dropping to a harsh, panicked rasp. "Wyatt, that smell, that taste. It's the Dawson Creek recipe. The one old man, Dawson, used to feed his gang before a raid. No one else knew it. No one." Bo stood up, his guns drawn, his eyes locked on Clara like she was a ghost that had just walked out of a grave. "Wyatt," Bo breathed. "If she's a Dawson, that means we just bought the daughter of the man we murdered 5 years ago." The silence in the cabin was suffocating, broken only by the aggressive crackle of the hearth and the ragged, terrified breathing of Clara. The barrel of Levi's Colt, .45, was a black, hollow eye, staring directly at her heart. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Wyatt said, his voice dropping an octave into a low, vibrating growl that rattled the tin plates on the table. He stepped around the shattered wood of the dining table, his massive frame blocking out the firelight. "Who taught you?" Clara pressed her back against the hot river stones of the fireplace, her hands trembling so violently she dropped the ladle. The clatter of iron on wood made Bo twitch, his twin revolvers steadying on her. "My mother," Clara sobbed, sliding down the stones until she hit the floorboards, pulling her knees to her chest. "Her name was Abigail Dawson. She left the Dakota territories before I was born. I don't know who you murdered. I don't know any of this." At the sound of the name times Abigail, the icy fury in Levi's eyes fractured. He looked at Wyatt, the gun in his hand, wavering for the very first time. "Abigail," Bo whispered, lowering his weapons a fraction of an inch. "Wyatt, Dawson had a daughter who ran off with an Easterner 10 years before the Creek Massacre. She hated the old man, hated the gang. Dawson used to beat her nearly to death for refusing to ride with them. Wyatt's steel-gray eyes scanned Clara's terrified face. He was searching for the lie, looking for the deceptive, cold-blooded glint that every member of the Dawson gang possessed. But all he found was a frightened, desperate young woman who had just cooked a meal to survive. Slowly, deliberately, Wyatt reached out and pushed the barrel of Levi's gun toward the floor. "Stand down, Levi," Wyatt commanded, the authority in his voice, leaving no room for argument. "She's Dawson blood, Wyatt," Levi snarled, though he holstered the weapon. The jagged scar on his face flushed an angry, vivid pink. "You know what that animal did to us. You know what he did to little Mary." "And she is not him," Wyatt barked, his voice suddenly roaring through the cabin like a thunderclap. He stepped into Levi's space, the two massive men chest to chest. "She didn't burn our homestead. She didn't lock our sister in that barn. She was sitting in a parlor in Boston while we sent her grandfather to hell. Look at her, Levi. She's a civilian." Bo sighed, the tension draining out of his shoulders as he spun his revolvers and slid them smoothly back into his holsters. He walked over to the table, sat back down, and picked up his spoon. He took another bite of the stew, closing his eyes. "Well, I'll be damned. The old man was a butcher, but his recipe is still the best thing I've tasted in 5 years. Wyatt turned back to Clara. He crouched down in front of her, his massive presence overwhelming, but the violent edge was gone. For the first time since she stepped off the train in Missoula, Clara saw something resembling humanity in his eyes. It was a heavy, suffocating sorrow. "Old man Dawson was a monster," Wyatt said quietly, his voice rough. "He ran a gang of cutthroats across the Wyoming and Dakota territories. 5 years ago, they raided our farm. They took everything from us. So, we tracked them to Dawson Creek, and we slaughtered every last one of them." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. "You're outlaws?" "No," Wyatt replied, his jaw tightening. "We're the men who killed the outlaws. The law was too afraid to touch. We took this claim to disappear." He reached out, his massive calloused hand, surprisingly gentle as he wiped a tear from her pale cheek. His thumb brushed against her jaw, sending a sudden, shocking jolt of heat straight to her core. "You bought a Dawson," Clara whispered, the irony of the situation tasting like ash in her mouth. "I bought a wife," Wyatt corrected, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. The predatory look was back, but it wasn't violent anymore. It was intensely, undeniably possessive. "And the mountain has decided you belong here." Over the next 3 weeks, the dynamic inside the cabin shifted dramatically. The terror that had paralyzed Clara slowly morphed into a strange, intoxicating tension. The blizzard continued to rage, sealing the four of them in a frozen world of their own making. Levi stopped treating her like a trespasser. While he rarely spoke, he began leaving chopped firewood by her bedroom door and anonymously sharpening her kitchen knives. Bo spent his evenings playing the harmonica by the fire, charming Clara with wild, exaggerated tales of his youth, actively trying to make her laugh. But it was Wyatt who consumed her every thought. The eldest Callahan brother was a force of nature, and Clara quickly realized that underneath his terrifying exterior was a fiercely protective man. He watched her constantly. Whenever she stretched to reach a hanging pot, his eyes lingered on the curve of her waist. Whenever she smiled at Bo's jokes, a muscle in Wyatt's jaw would jump with suppressed jealousy. The physical attraction between them was becoming a dangerous, unspoken entity in the small cabin. One evening, while Levi and Bo were in the adjacent barn tending to the mules, Clara was pulling a heavy iron skillet from the hearth. The rag she was using slipped, and the searing hot metal burned her palm. She gasped, dropping the skillet with a loud crash. Before she could even inspect the burn, Wyatt was there. He moved with a terrifying, liquid speed, crossing the room in 2 strides. "Let me see," he demanded, taking her hand. "It's fine, Wyatt. It's just a blister." "Quiet," he murmured. He led her to the wash basin, gently submerging her hand in the freezing snow water. Clara shivered, but not from the cold. Wyatt was standing incredibly close. The heat radiating off his massive chest was a stark contrast to the freezing water. She could smell the pine resin, wood smoke, and raw leather on his skin. He kept his large hand wrapped securely around her delicate wrist. "You've been working too hard," Wyatt said softly, his thumb tracing the blue veins on her wrist. "I'm proving I belong here," Clara breathed, looking up at him. Wyatt's steel-gray eyes darkened. He stepped closer, pinning her gently between his body and the wooden washstand. "You proved that, the night you made the stew, Clara. You don't have to fight us anymore." "I'm not fighting," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. Wyatt lowered his head, his face inches from hers. "Then, stop hiding in that room at night. You're my wife, in name and by law." "Wyatt." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a fleeting, agonizingly gentle touch that sent a wildfire racing through Clara's veins. She had never been kissed. She had never felt the raw, overpowering desire of a man who looked at her as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. Before he could claim her lips fully, the heavy oak door of the cabin exploded inward. The blast of a shotgun shattered the hinges, sending splinters of wood flying across the room. The wind howled through the doorway, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of cocking rifles. Wyatt instantly shoved Clara behind the washstand, drawing his Winchester from the nearest table in a single fluid motion. Standing in the doorway, backed by a half-dozen heavily armed men wearing thick winter dusters, was Josiah Gannon. Gannon was a notorious black-hearted bounty hunter who had been trailing the myth of the Dawson Creek gold for half a decade. "Evening, Callahans," Gannon drawled, his voice a nasty, nasal sneer. He spit a stream of black tobacco juice onto Clara's freshly swept floor. "I heard a rumor, down in Missoula. Heard some Eastern girl bought a ticket with Dawson gold. Imagine my surprise when I found out she married the very men who wiped out her granddaddy." Wyatt leveled his rifle directly at Gannon's chest. "You stepped into the wrong cabin, Josiah." "I don't think so," Gannon grinned, exposing rotting teeth. "The Dawson gang had 20,000 in stolen gold hidden before you boys gunned them down. The girl knows where it is. I'm taking her. You hand her over, and maybe we leave enough of you alive to bury yourselves. If you touch her," Wyatt's voice was the sound of a closing coffin, "I will peel the skin from your bones." The cabin erupted into a deafening roar of gunpowder and violence. Wyatt fired his Winchester, the heavy, 44-40 round, catching the man next to Gannon squarely in the chest, throwing him back into the snowdrift. Gannon dove behind the heavy doorframe, his shotgun blasting a hole through the washstand, showering Clara in splinters and freezing water. From the barn, the explosive sounds of a counterattack began. Levi and Bo were charging through the blizzard, firing blindly into the backs of Gannon's men. "Bo! Flank right!" Levi roared, his voice cutting through the howling wind. Levi's twin Colts spat fire, dropping a deputy who was trying to climb through a side window. Inside the cabin, it was absolute chaos. The air filled with thick, choking white gun smoke. Clara covered her ears, screaming as bullets tore through her mother's leather satchel and shredded the wool blankets on the bed. "Clara, stay down!" Wyatt yelled over the gunfire. He was a machine of calculated destruction, firing, levering, and firing again with lethal precision. But there were too many of them. Gannon had brought an army. A deputy managed to breach the threshold, his rifle aimed directly at Wyatt's back as Wyatt exchanged fire with men in the tree line. Clara didn't think. The Eastern girl, who had been paralyzed by fear weeks ago, was dead, burned away by the harsh reality of the Bitterroot Mountains. She saw Levi's hunting knife resting on the cutting board. She scrambled across the floor, grabbed the heavy blade, and lunged. She drove the knife into the deputy's thigh just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wild, burying itself in the roof beams. The man screamed, backhanding Clara across the face. She hit the floorboards hard, her vision swimming. Wyatt spun around. Seeing Clara bleeding on the floor triggered a primal, terrifying rage in the mountain man. He didn't bother racking his rifle. He grabbed the barrel, swung the heavy wooden stock like a baseball bat, and crushed the deputy's skull with a sickening crunch. Outside, the gunfire suddenly ceased. Bo walked through the shattered doorway, bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, his revolvers smoking. Levi followed, wiping blood from his cheek, his ice-blue eyes scanning the carnage. "They're done," Levi rasped, stepping over a body. Gannon lay near the fireplace, clutching a shattered collarbone, gasping for air. Wyatt walked over to him, pulled his heavy Colt from his hip, and pressed the barrel directly between the bounty hunter's eyes. "Tell the devil the Callahan sent you," Wyatt whispered, and pulled the trigger. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in Clara's ears. She sat up slowly, clutching her bleeding lip, trembling from the sheer, overwhelming adrenaline of the violence she had just witnessed and participated in. Wyatt dropped his gun. He fell to his knees in front of her, his massive hands gently gripping her shoulders. He frantically checked her over for bullet holes, his chest heaving. "I'm okay," Clara breathed, tears mixing with the soot on her face. "I'm okay, Wyatt." Levi walked over, looking down at the dead deputy, then at the bloody knife Clara had used. For the first time since she met him, the terrifying middle brother smiled. It wasn't a sneer, it was genuine respect. "I told you she wasn't useless, Wyatt." Bo chuckled, wincing as he held his shoulder. "She's a Dawson, Levi. They fight dirty." Wyatt ignored them both. He looked at Clara, his steel-gray eyes filled with absolute adoration. He slid his hands into her hair, pulling her face to his. This kiss was not gentle. It was possessive, bruising, and desperate. It was the kiss of a man claiming his territory, sealing a bond forged in blood, cordite, and surviving the deadliest winter the territory had ever seen. Clara kissed him back fiercely, her hands gripping the thick wool of his coat. She had come to the mountains to pay off a debt. But as Wyatt pulled her against his chest, with his brothers guarding the shattered door, Clara knew she had found something a fortune in gold could never buy. She was no longer a frightened mail-order bride. She was Clara Callahan, and she was exactly where she belonged. What a wild, blood-soaked ride, from a desperate virgin with a dark family secret to the undisputed queen of the Callahan brothers' mountain fortress. Clara's journey proves that the Wild West was no place for the faint of heart. If you loved this intense, action-packed historical romance, make sure to smash that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves a gritty pioneer story, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life historical dramas. See you next time.